guys, ETJ Writes here. Welcome back to Story Analysis 101. Today, we are going to be talking about WandaVision. The series just recently finished airing, and I enjoyed watching every moment of it. It was a really fantastic series. Going into WandaVision, yes, I was aware of the fan theories, particularly because of the comics background, but I refused to watch any of the trailers, and I was able to go into it almost as fresh as possible. I learned my lesson way back with Age of Ultron. I got way too invested in spoilers and rumors and spec, and the movie wasn't as enjoyable for me as it could have been if I hadn't kind of ruined the experience beforehand. So even though some of the fan theories didn't quite pan out, I wasn't as disappointed as I perhaps could have been. One of the things I like doing in watching a show like this, and I did it for The Mandalorian as well, is to watch other people's reactions. I'm selective with who I watch, and this one channel, I'll put the link right here. This one channel that I was watching really turned me on to the idea of looking at WandaVision as a lens through which to explore Wanda's grief. Once I saw that reading, I realized that that was probably the most correct, although any interpretation is correct, but the most correct, in my opinion, way to process, to understand, to view this series. And going into it from that perspective, I think really helped solidify my feelings about this series, which is that it's phenomenal. And today, we're going to be looking at WandaVision through the analysis of grief, and specifically through the structure that is very traditionally presented to tell stories like this, which would be the tragedy. And not any kind of tragedy, the classic Greek tragedies of the past. Of course, Shakespeare used the Greek principle in his plays as well, like Romeo and Juliet and Macbeth and Julius Caesar. When we think of Greek tragedies, there are some extremely famous ones that come to mind that I will be referencing throughout this. Oedipus, and we can think of Antigone, which is actually the sequel to Oedipus. There's a series of 3 plays. And it's really important for me to reference the Greek tragedies because this is the whole framework on which modern storytelling hangs its linchpin. If we look at how classic Greek tragedies are set up, classic Greek plays really, there's a story being told, and there's people off to the side, we're going to call them the chorus, and they sort of tell the story, and then we see the events unfold. And they actually did this to great effect in Disney's Hercules. Of course, that's a comedy, but we have the muses who sing their song, they're telling us what's going on. They take the place of that Greek chorus. While WandaVision doesn't explicitly have a chorus that tells us what's going on, the whole framework of the sitcom trope actually is the chorus, because if we've grown up with these sitcoms, we understand how this framing works. So when we see the first black and white episode, we know, oh, that's Dick Van Dyke and I Love Lucy. And then as we go on through the ages, we understand there's a framework of telling us how the story is unfolding. Of course, then we also have Agatha in one of her episodes where she explains what's going on from her perspective, and then we have the sword agents who are telling us their version of what's going on. So in subtle ways, we have this reference back to this chorus that is very common in the Greek plays. But specifically in the Greek tragedies, there's a certain reason for them. The Greeks didn't write tragedies just because they were fond of sad stories. Rather, there would be festivals put on every year that people would attend, and you would have comedies and you would have tragedies presented at these festivals. The reason was because the Greeks believed very strongly in this idea of catharsis. Catharsis is the process by which you are able to express your emotions, and by expressing them, live a more full life. So if you're sad, you express your sad emotions, you're able to grieve and move on. If you're happy, you can bring to the forefront all these wonderful, happy emotions and be able to, again, live a more full life because you're more in touch with your inner emotions. And the Greeks believed this was very important. They also had people who put on the plays to win prizes because it was a competition. So new plays would be premiered every year, but they would also go and see the same plays over and over. even knowing how they ended. And that was actually part of the catharsis for them. When you think of something that's sad, you know how it ends. There's a finality to it. But it's also unresolved because those feelings bubble up over and over. And so the Greeks would see these plays over and over and learn how to deal with grief by expressing it and then letting it go. You know, it's really weird how these things work out. The timing of Wonder Woman's release was not something that the filmmakers anticipated going into this. But it comes at a really interesting and I think needed time for so many people. Because as we all know, 2020 was a very difficult year. And a lot of people lost a lot of other people that were very important to them. I think WandaVision had such a deep impact on so many people because they could relate to what Wanda was feeling. And the one episode that was just so beautiful, so touching, was when she's talking to Vision and she describes her grief as waves washing over her over and over again. And just when she thinks she can get out from under it, more waves come and just knock her down. This grief is just all-consuming. And that's when we get that wonderful line delivered so beautifully by Paul Bettany that says,
"But what is grief, if not love persevering?"
And that line resonated with so many people. I know it resonated with me. I was very emotional watching that episode. I'm glad I'm not someone who films my reactions because I would have not been presentable for a camera. I was really, really overcome by how beautiful that message was. And so this series, in a way, became more than just another interesting Marvel character analysis. It became a way by which many people who have suffered this year can actually process their grief. Because as the Greeks knew, it's important to get in touch with our inner emotions. And when something tragic happens in our lives, it's very difficult for our brains to process that because it's really happening. But when we're reading a sad story or watching a sad movie, even though we've processed a grief that's not actually real, we've actually really felt those emotions. We really cried. And we're able to, in some small way, move on from the real grief in our lives. And that's why telling tragic stories is so important. But another aspect of telling tragic stories that the Greeks understood very well is as a cautionary tale. The concept of hubris, arrogant pride, comes from the Greek classic tragedies. This is where we want to talk about destiny and fate, a topic that plays so well into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Because as it's revealed throughout the series, Wanda was always destined to be who she is. When she has her beautiful costume reveal and Agatha says, "This is who you are," it's something she was destined to do all along. And of course they went back and retconned that she had the power within her all along, like Dumbo. But it's really true. She could not fight her fate, no matter how much she wanted to. And the more she fought against what the world was pressing down on her and the responsibilities she has as a cosmic entity, the more she was driven toward that. Of course, the first accident that happened when she was a child was not something that she could control. But the minute she started fighting back against her fate, when she reached out her hand and stopped the bomb from going off, when she then got involved with Hydra, no matter how ill-advised that was, and when she touched the Mind Stone, and so on and so on and so on, meeting up with Captain America and the Avengers, all the adventures she'd been through until the point where she then ended up in Westview. Every time she did something to try and further her path in life, it just made her more powerful, setting her on this collision path to more and more grief. And that's the power of a great tragedy. If we think about the story of Oedipus Rex, according to how the play goes, Oedipus, his mother and father, received prophecy that their son would one day kill his father. And they didn't want that to happen, so they said, well, let's get rid of him. So they sent him off, and he was rescued by a shepherd and taken care of. And then, as a young man, he went through all these adventures, ended up becoming a great hero, and he ended up killing the king, which later it's found out that's his father. But he doesn't find that out for a long time. He actually goes on to marry the king's wife, which that's really disturbing because unknown to him, that's actually his mother. And then all these things happen. And once he finally discovers this horrible thing that's happened, that he killed his father and his wife is the person who birthed him, he ends up blinding himself because he cannot live with the horrible things that he's accidentally done. And then he leaves and basically exiles himself because he can't live with himself anymore. And then it goes on in the story of Antigone, his daughter, and all the tragic things that happened to her, and so on and so forth. And it's a cautionary tale. The more you fight against your fate, the more horrible it's going to end up being. If Oedipus's parents hadn't sent him out into the wilderness, maybe he would have still somehow killed his father, but maybe it would have been an accident, like they were talking and the old man fell over the parapets, or they were off on an adventure and bandits attacked him, and in trying to defeat off the bandits he accidentally stabbed his father. It would have been inevitable either way. But because of the secrecy and the lies and the pride of his parents to think that they could outwit destiny, they cursed themselves and they cursed Oedipus. Oedipus was innocent in all this. He didn't want this to happen. And we can relate that back to Wanda. She's kind of innocent. But the more she fights against the horrible things that have happened to her, the more it takes her down this dark path. We can also apply this to Agatha as well, because she got too proud and too curious, and ultimately it was her undoing. I did see some complaints where people were saying, how did Wanda learn all these things? If Agatha says you need training to do it, how come Wanda can just do it? Well, you've got to look at the fact that Agatha is up there saying, according to the Darkhold, you don't need all this fancy stuff. You can basically just snap your fingers and do it. And we see that once Wanda sees that something can be done, like when Agatha disappeared, then Wanda disappeared as well. Then she was able to learn it and subsequently draw on the knowledge that she's seen. Maybe she has a photographic memory, just like Steve Rogers, and she was able to then recreate the runes and win the battle. So Agatha, underestimating her opponent, was ultimately the cause of her own downfall. So it's a little bit of a tragedy for Agatha as well, and that's what a good tragedy does. It doesn't just bring down the main character, it affects everybody in the story. For example, taking it back to Oedipus. Oedipus is affected, Jocasta is affected, and Antigone is affected. And there's this ripple effect that messes up his whole life, and because he's the king, the lives of pretty much everybody under him, because there's this big war and things go terribly. And we see this happen very much in WandaVision. It's this beautiful tragedy where the harder she tries, the worse things get. And that's really exemplified and shown by these little cracks in her universe. The more she tries to be happy and rewind things, the more suspicious it is to the people on the outside, and the more she loses her grip over reality. The other thing that makes this such a beautiful tragedy is the fact that it's inevitable, and I've talked a bunch about destiny in this. But a good tragedy will have you looking at all the different steps along the way and saying, but if only they did this, then this could have happened. And if only they did this, then this could have happened. Like in Romeo and Juliet, where you're like, if she didn't immediately drink the poison, then they wouldn't have died. And if Romeo hadn't looked at Juliet and decided to stab himself, if he just waited a little bit longer, then they wouldn't have died. And so on and so forth, where the characters make bad decisions if only they hadn't made them. But then you go back and you look through the story and you realize there was no other option. And that's the beauty of a good tragedy, where you're like, if only, but no, if only it was always destined to be this way. And having caught on to the fact that this was a classic tragedy about halfway through, I realized there was no way there was going to be a happy ending for any of the characters. I even made a quick post on social media about it. I'm calling it now. Despite the layers of sitcom that the show is wrapped in, WandaVision is actually set up like a classic tragedy. It was never going to end well for any of the characters. I didn't have any cosplay supplies, so that filter was my cosplay. And because of that, I just knew going into the ending that yes, things were going to be resolved. And yes, we had a great superhero battle moment between many of the characters that was really fun to watch. But there was no way it was going to end happily. So Wanda, in the end, lost everything. She lost her family. She lost the feeling of happiness that she had. She lost the fact that she thought she was making other people happy. When she first drives into Westview, you see how unhappy everybody is. And she tried to give them all better lives and realized she was just making it worse. And ultimately, she lost even more respect because we've seen Wanda, every time she gets too powerful, she gets locked away. And so we know that SWORD is going to be all over her back, if not SWORD, then other secret organizations, knowing that she did a pretty messed up thing. And she, in some ways, is the villain of the story. She's definitely the protagonist, but she's also the antagonist as well. Because without her, there would be no Westview sitcom happy life. And that's totally okay. It's really interesting when you look at tragedies because we are taking flawed people and pushing it to the extremes. I think one of the saddest tragedies has to be Othello, because the way Othello ends is just really heartbreaking. Of course, Iago is kind of like Othello's Agatha, always stepping in and messing things up. But it didn't have to end that way, except that it did. And we see that same thing in WandaVision. So she's worked through her grief. She let Vision go. But she's more alone than ever. And as we see at the post-credits scene, she still has a hole in her life that she's trying to fill. And that's the sad bit about it. There's resolution, but at the same time, no resolution. Which is what makes it such a classic tragedy. We're sad, and we go through those emotions with her, and we're able to close the chapter on the book at the end of the day. We're able to turn off Disney Plus and say, okay, I've gone through my grief, I've experienced this story, I'm done with it. But just like the families of Romeo and Juliet that had to keep living with the knowledge of what had happened, and the people in Oedipus's kingdom who were messed up forever, just like those people, we know that in WandaVision, people have to keep living with the tragedy of what's happened. And it's a cautionary tale. For the Greeks, that tale would be, don't fight your fate, because the more you fight against your fate, the worse things get. I think for us these days, it's more, be wise, and don't let your grief allow you to make foolish decisions that will ultimately destroy your life. I do have a couple closing thoughts on this. I haven't seen Wonder Woman 1984, but I know there's a very similar scene where Wonder Woman has to give up the life that she had through the power of the Dream Stone or the Wish Stone, whatever it is, Monkey's Paw, to save the world. And Wanda here has to do the same thing. Now, I believe WandaVision did a better job than Wonder Woman 1984 in exploring this similar concept of the hero having something that they've always wanted and having to give it up for the betterment of the world. Now, you see, in Wonder Woman 1984, we have this issue of consent with Steve Trevor inhabiting the body of somebody who we don't know whether or not they signed up for the adventures that they go on with Wonder Woman. And there's plenty of videos out there you can find on the ethical ramifications of everything that happened. We have the exact same thing in WandaVision, where Wanda just takes over a bunch of people's minds without their consent. But it's not presented as a good thing. I believe in Wonder Woman 1984, like I said, I haven't watched it, but there isn't a discussion from everything that I've read and heard. There's no discussion on, oh dear, I took over this person's body, and now this person's life might be totally ruined by this. In WandaVision, the people straight up tell Wanda, you have ruined our lives. We have this pain. I haven't seen my daughter. My family is concerned about me. Agatha points it out, and also Vision calls Wanda out on it many times. He's like, Wanda, these people are in pain. I've been getting through to them. What are you doing? You have to stop. And I think that's the crux, the key difference between Wonder Woman 1984 and WandaVision, is that Wonder Woman doesn't really ever acknowledge that she did a bad thing with her wish. Sure, she has to undo it, but the only thing that's being touched upon is her sacrifice of her personal happiness. Whereas with WandaVision, she has to do it to save the people that she has enslaved mentally. So yes, losing her happiness is something that deeply affects her. But ultimately, it's the right thing to do to save the people that she hurt. And that's what makes Wanda such a wonderful, gray character. Because she's done some messed up stuff. But underneath it all, she knows right from wrong. She's trying to use her powers without hurting anybody. And she's in denial for most of the story about the fact that she's hurting people. But whenever Wanda realizes that she's done something that's not right, she tries to fix it, even if that comes at great personal cost to her. And that's something we see through the eyes of Monica Rambeau. She's able to understand that, Wanda, you gave up a lot. And Wanda's like, these people don't know it. They basically just know how I destroyed their lives for a week or so. I don't think that's me just being biased as a Marvel fan. I think if you compare those differences, you see how everything is presented. And it doesn't have to be rammed down your throat, although Agatha Harkness kind of is a little bit of a stand-in for that, taking us back to that idea of the Greek chorus. But you instinctively understand that what Wanda did wasn't right, but that she knows it wasn't right. And at the end, she seeks to atone for that. So just like Oedipus blinding himself and exiling himself from his country once he realizes what he's done, Wanda, technically she has no vision anymore, and she exiles herself to a faraway country to live out the rest of her days. Or so it would seem. Of course, this is Marvel and we have more to go. But I think WandaVision is just a beautiful example of a classic tragedy. It has all those hallmark tropes where you're trying to fight your fate, and the more you do, the worse things get. Your pride gets in the way and leads to your ultimate downfall. You learn a lesson about what you should and shouldn't do. And ultimately, once you realize what you've done is wrong, you try to make amends. And for us, the audience, I believe there are some powerful lessons that we can learn from that. The Greeks knew it. That's why they put on those plays every year. I actually think it's really awesome that Falcon and the Winter Soldier is coming out pretty much directly right after WandaVision, because it looks like it's going to be something a little bit more lighthearted. And the Greeks thought that it was a great idea to pair tragedy with comedy. You have to express both those spectrums. Get out your sad feelings, embrace your happy feelings, put it all together, and really embrace that we are complex people with complex emotions that need to be explored in a safe, healthy way. So kudos to Marvel in creating some of the best television I've seen in a long time. I think people who went into it expecting big superhero explosions may be a little bit disappointed, because at its core, Marvel does not tell stories about superheroes. Marvel tells stories about people who just happen to have superpowered abilities. And WandaVision just brought Marvel back to that beautiful core storytelling that I have always loved. I do have to tip my hat to Elizabeth Olsen and Paul Bettany. They did some of the most beautiful character work acting I have ever seen. And I really am so happy that they're a part of the Marvel Universe and that Marvel was able to get them to stretch their acting chops in a way that the previous movies didn't allow them to. So hats off to everybody involved in this project. It was fantastic. In conclusion, although WandaVision is framed in the classic sitcom tropes that make you laugh and have fun, it really, really is a classic tragedy in all the right ways. I'll see you back here again when I have another piece of storytelling that we are going to analyze. Until next time, ETJ out.